Welcome back to the channel. This video is looking at the carbon cycle. It's a video in a larger series that includes all of the biogeochemical cycles, which includes the water cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the sulfur cycle, phosphorus cycle, and this video, which is the carbon cycle. Now, these cycles all play an integral part of moving elements and chemicals around our planet in order for it to function as a living, breathing entity, and how these spheres connect and interlinked to create our planet and form our very complex ecosystems. And carbon is one of those integral elements that is required not only for life to be sustained, but the growth and maintenance of life on this planet. So let's check out the carbon cycle. This is the Earth Science Classroom. The carbon cycle acts and operates as a system which moves carbon between various parts of the system. The sink or pool or reservoir is the storage of the carbon and where it stays for a certain amount of time, and that time can be calculated and estimated in what we call a residence time. And the amount of carbon can also be estimated that exists in a particular sink for a certain amount of time. And then once that carbon's moved through various mechanisms or processes on the planet, we call that a flux. And the flux can be in certain size and again a certain duration of how long it's going to stay in flux, but in between a sink or reservoir or pool. So this system is designed to show the movement and storage of carbon throughout our planet, and the key terms are sink, pool, reservoir, flux, and residence time. So for the carbon cycle, there are 5 major carbon sinks or carbon reservoirs or carbon pools where the carbon is stored for a certain amount of time. Now, each storage or each pool is different in its characteristic, in size, and also how long the carbon is stored in that particular pool or reservoir. So the first one is the lithosphere. It's the upper mantle and crust. It is the rocky layers towards the surface of the planet which contains the majority of the carbon. This is also held in fossil fuels, in which we extract and burn to obtain energy through the hydrocarbons, which will obviously add additional carbon back into the system, which would have normally been held for a long time within this lithospheric pool or reservoir. Then we have the global oceans as a carbon sink, and how carbon is diffused and dissolved into the ocean water, the salt water, and held there where there are various chemical reactions to either hold the carbon within the ocean or to move the carbon from the ocean back into the atmosphere or back into the lithosphere. Then we have the soil. Soil is a carbon sink. It is a smaller size sink compared to obviously the lithosphere and the oceans. However, soil plays an integral part of holding the carbon and moving the carbon not only into the biomass, but also back into the lithosphere and also in runoff and erosion back into the oceans. Then we have the atmosphere contains the CO2 gas, even though it's a very small percentage, around 0.04%. Currently, the atmosphere plays an important role of moving that carbon from storage or from flux, from pool to pool or reservoir to reservoir. And finally, the 5th pool or reservoir is the biomass, the vegetation, the flora and fauna, the animals and plants that contain the carbon not only in themselves as part of their cells and their actual physical makeup, but you have the movement of carbon through the biomass, through the vegetation and the animals, into the soil, into the atmosphere and the oceans. On Earth, the majority of the carbon is stored in the lithosphere, which includes the upper mantle and the crust, layers of rock, which also includes metamorphic and igneous rocks. However, the focus and where the carbon is mostly stored is in the sedimentary rocks, which forms from the accumulation of sediments in certain environments through burial and sedimentation and various processes that take those sediments, glue them together basically, push them together and bury them into layers based on geologic principles and they form eventually sedimentary rocks, which the main ones are the carbonate minerals, which form certain sedimentary rocks like limestone and dolostone, and if the limestone is further compressed and heated, it will turn into marble, which is metamorphic. But the main rocks are sedimentary, and this is where the majority of the carbon is stored through the carbonate mineral group within those sedimentary rocks. And the cycling of this carbon, so the main carbon storage sink is the rock layers, and once it's there, it can be then transferred and allocated through the system, through the cycle, through the soil, through the biomass, through the atmosphere, and eventually also through the oceans, and then back into the rocks through a term called calcification and sedimentation, the forming of sedimentary rocks. But the main principle here is that the carbon is starting in the rock layers as the main source, the main abundant volume of carbon, and then transferred within the other carbon sinks throughout the Earth's spheres and then back into the rocks as that completed cycle. After the lithosphere, the oceans are the second biggest carbon sink or reservoir or pool on the planet or within the system, and it plays an important role in cycling and moving the CO2 between various spheres and to maintain the influx of CO2 back into the lithosphere. CO2 enters the ocean through dissolved gases from the atmosphere and a little bit from the incoming stream flow rivers off the land into the water, into the oceans. From there, the CO2 is going to react with water, H2O, and form various chemical compounds within the ocean. For example, you have carbonic acid, H2CO3, and bicarbonate ions, which is HCO3 negative. These can dissociate or react in the ocean. So if they dissociate, you'd release free hydrogen ions, which would then lower the pH of the oceans to less alkali to a more acidic, which is called ocean acidification. And you also release a free carbonate ion, which the carbonate ion will react with the incoming calcium, which is coming from the weather and erosion of rocks through water as an erosional agent and transportation, and arrive in the oceans from that source. And the calcium would react with the CO3 negative and form CaCO3, which is calcium carbonate. Now, this is the main cycle of carbon that's going to go back from the oceans into the lithosphere, and this is called calcification. So what happens is the CaCO3 is used by animals, marine animals, to build their shells and their skeletons or exoskeletons, and once those animals die, they're going to fall down to the bottom of the ocean floor and accumulate along the ocean floor. The animals will die and decay, and what's left is the calcium carbonate shells, which are going to be buried, accumulate under heat and pressure, and this is called calcification, and this would eventually turn into lithification of forming various sedimentary rocks such as limestone and dolostone. And the cycle of carbon from outside the oceans, from the atmosphere or the terrestrial sources, will go through the ocean, through this process, and go back into the sedimentary rocks to be stored for a long time as a carbon storage. Rocks can also erode and be weathered on the ocean floor and re-release the carbon back into the oceans. So you have the presence of both dissolved organic carbon through the marine animals and the use of the carbon through their shells to form calcium carbonate shells. And you also have the DIC, which is dissolved inorganic carbon, which is basically the CO2 reacting with the bicarbonate, the carbonate, and the carbonic acid to form different compounds within the ocean without any kind of biological influence. So the animals, the biological influence would be called a biological pump, which is used to balance the system and to maintain the movement and flux of CO2, of the carbon, through the ocean system. We also have physical pumps, which are basically the circulation of the ocean through downwelling and upwelling and ocean currents that's going to move the carbon through different compounds and molecules around the ocean to eventually form the calcium carbonate and be pumped out through the biological component to form calcification. Our next carbon sink is soils, and soils play a vital role in transferring the carbon into both the biomass and to circulate it back into the lithosphere, back into the atmosphere, and eventually also through weather and erosion and soil erosion and water going back into the oceans. So the soil contains carbon through organic material or organic matter, so SOM, and this can be between 10 to 30% of the soil could be made up from organic material, both in the topsoil, which includes the O and the A horizon. And this would be from the decomposition of organic material, the biomass, and also the transfer of carbon through the breakdown of rocks and minerals, which form the basis for soil. That can occur through percolation of water, the breaking down through chemical weathering of the minerals, and the leaching of nutrients and carbon from the topsoil down to the subsoil, the B and C horizons, for uptake through plant roots and nodules. So this organic material, SOM, could also be called humus or detritus and leaf litter, and it can vary greatly based on the biome, the ecosystem, the climate, the amount of precipitation the soil receives, and the amount of organic material in terms of the organisms in order to turn over the soil, in terms of the soil type, the amount of clay, silt and sand that is in the soil, which would then help to retain the water and retain the essential nutrients, the cation exchange capacity, which is basically going to impact the amount of carbon that can be exchanged and taken by the plants to use for growth. And then we can discuss the interaction with biomass, the vegetation, the flora and fauna, and the storage of carbon through the plants and animals that exist on land. The key transfer for vegetation, flora, is the uptake of CO2 in the use of photosynthesis, to take the gas with the sunlight and convert it within the plants, within the leaves and the chloroplasts, to usable sugars and glucose for the vegetation to use as fuel. And also the respiration of animals and fauna respiring out CO2 back into the atmosphere. The last carbon sink or pool or reservoir has to be discussed is the atmosphere. Now, the atmosphere has a very small quantity of carbon in the CO2 gas, and this equates to 0.04% of the atmosphere in total. The atmosphere is composed of mostly nitrogen and then a small part of oxygen and a little part of argon, and CO2 is one of those trace gases, those greenhouse gases that exist in the atmosphere as a limiting factor in terms of the small amount. However, if it changes by a small degree, it's going to have a large impact on the system, both in the influx of CO2 in the oceans and also with the biomass in regards to photosynthesis. The next discussion is the human impact, the anthropogenic impact of this cycle in terms of the addition or removal of CO2 from the cycle, in terms of the balance, the natural pumps that work both in the biomass, the soil, the rock layers, and of course the oceans, and how the excess CO2 from various human processes and activities will account for a change in the system, which we see mostly in the atmosphere and the oceans as a key indicator of the changes of CO2. For example, you add more CO2 in the atmosphere, you'll get a naturally more dissolved CO2 in the oceans, and that will cause a higher amount of free hydrogens to be produced through dissolution, through the chemical reactions, and that would then lower the pH of the oceans. This has happened over the last 150 years, where there has been a slight lowering and acidification of the oceans, which has a great impact on the ecosystems that exist in the oceans as a careful balance. When you imbalance or remove that balance of CO2, you're going to have an adverse effect on the ecosystems that are existing in the oceans. Also, you might have an impact on the biomass. However, if we continue deforestation, we continue the removal, extraction and combustion of fossil fuels, releasing all of that carbon that's stored in the sedimentary rocks and the influx of CO2 into the atmosphere. This is a positive feedback loop where you're just removing the carbon sinks but adding more carbon in a flux, so it has to go somewhere. So the human element is very important to consider with the carbon cycle and every biogeochemical cycle on the Earth. This is the Earth Science Classroom. Thanks for watching the video. If you liked it, please subscribe, like and share. And if you want more content and videos on Earth Science, please check out my channel.